I'm WTOP's Mike Murillo. I'd like to thank you everybody on Facebook Live for joining us. We have a special guest in the studio today. He's Mike Raup. He's the head of everything bugs when it comes to the University of Maryland. And talk about what you do over there and tell people about yourself a bit.
Oh, my goodness, Michael. Well, they call me the bug guy for good reason, I guess. One of the things I like to do the most is to try to demystify bugs, help the general public and the various clientele we serve understand bugs, how they go about their puny little lives, and what risks and benefits they provide for human beings.
All right, well, let's get started. You brought some special guests in the studio today.
Absolutely.
We start with the mosquitoes. And talk a bit about, obviously, the weather this year. The big concern is mosquitoes, which carry several diseases, which are bad for humans and many other animals as well. But just talk about what we could expect to see this year and what's contributing to that.
Yeah. Well, Michael, I brought along with me about 500 little vampires. These are the yellow fever mosquitoes, which are also the key vector of the Zika virus. So let's talk about that for just a moment here, Michael. I think with climate change, in a warming world, there are a variety of effects it will have on insects. Number one, what we're seeing now is a movement from the south to the north. More southern species of arthropods, ticks, certain other pests that we have are now moving more north. They're expanding into our range, into our habitats here. Things like the Lone Star tick, which used to be relatively rare. We're now finding this to be more common in my observations than things like the black-legged tick. So we're seeing a northward migration. Bugs are simply going to start earlier every year because it is simply warmer earlier, and they're going to go later every year. So the period of activity is extended, but perhaps, Mike, most important here is the fact that for several of our most important pests, we call these species multivoltine species, in other words, several generations. We are simply going to have more generations every year in a warming world. It's very simple. The warmer it is, the better probability that these cold intolerant species will succeed in overwintering. So in warm winters, we simply have more surviving. They start earlier, and there's a direct relationship between temperature and the developmental rate of insects. So the warmer it is, the faster they develop. So for these species like mosquitoes, at 70 degrees, it might take them 14 days to develop, but at 90, they're going to do it in 1 week. That means twice as many generations. So as our world gets warmer, and as it's warmer here in the DMV, we're simply going to have more generations of these very nuisance pests.
Now, I know the concern, too, with the Zika virus. That's been the big thing in the last couple of years here. And we've talked about which type of mosquito, the Aedes aegypti, which is the one that's mostly in Florida, but we do, or the southern area, I guess,
yes,
of the country. But are we seeing them more up here now, too, these carriers of the Zika virus?
That's a major concern right now, that we will have range expansion. Historically, we've had yellow fever mosquitoes here for centuries, literally. In the late 1700s, there was an outbreak in Philadelphia that chased the Continental Congress out of Philadelphia down to Germantown. So they do persist in this area, and we learned a couple years ago there is actually a breeding population right here in Washington, D.C., that is somewhere underneath the Capitol. And in the summertime, these yellow fever mosquitoes simply bubble out from their place underground and feed on the people here, right here in Washington, D.C. So it is a concern.
All right, since you brought them here for show and tell,
yes,
just give us a little demonstration. Just show the mosquitoes off there and tell us what makes them, we all like to smash them, but they are pretty amazing little beings there that, and what they do and how they survive.
Yeah, well, these are actually quite incredible. If you, can you have a peek in here? Got him? All right, now we're going to give them a little bit of carbon dioxide and watch what happens.
A little carbon dioxide there. And
so basically, Michael, what these mosquitoes do is they find their host, they track human beings like us by the various gases that we give off. No offense, but we give off more than 100 different kinds of volatile compounds.
What are you talking about?
Yeah, well, some people more, some people less. But fundamentally, they're tracking carbon dioxide and lactic acid nanol and some aromatic compounds. And it's this unique blend of compounds that people give off that make one person an attractor and someone else unattractive. I'm not very attractive to mosquitoes, but whenever I go out in the field, I always take an attractor with me.
That's why my girlfriend's great for that. I never get bit when I'm around her. So I guess you're right, though. Everybody has that sort of thing. Talk about what you have here to battle these guys. Obviously, we have to go outside. We can't hide inside while they're out. So what do we do?
Right. Well, there are various kinds of repellents. I think personal protection, frankly, when you're outside with mosquitoes in the summertime, personal protection is your best bet. So you're not going to wear dark-colored clothing. You're going to wear loose-fitting, light-colored clothing. This will help keep those mosquitoes off. We can actually purchase lines of clothing. There are certain brands that are pre-treated with mosquito repellents. These will be good for as many as 70 washings. They will help to repel those mosquitoes that might want to attack. We can also buy this particular compound. This is called permethrin. You can apply this to your trouser legs or your boots or your clothing. This will also repel mosquitoes. The other nice thing about permethrin, it's going to repel ticks as well.
And we're going to get into ticks, but yeah, that's an important thing as well. This stuff is used. How does it work? You spray it on the clothes, you leave it there, that sort of thing?
Absolutely, yes. This only goes on clothing, whereas these other products, things that contain DEET, which is really the gold standard of mosquito and insect repellents, this is going to give you 8 hours of protection. Hey, if I'm going into a place with malaria or something like this, dengue, I'm probably going to use a DEET product. In places here, for example, if I'm going to be outdoors hiking on the C&O Canal, I'm going to use probably a non-DEET alternative. This is called picaridin. Not everybody likes to use DEET. This is also going to give me about 8 hours of protection. And if I'm just going out to work in the garden for a couple hours, I'm going to use this one. This is botanically based. This contains the oil of lemon eucalyptus. This is going to give me nice 4 hours of protection. I'm going to probably use this when I'm working around in the yard.
What about the people who have parties and you get the citronella candles? Do those work? Are those effective at all?
Citronella will give you a modicum of protection. It's been found to reduce biting. Basically, these insects, essential oils can be effective repellents. They're not going to be nearly as effective as some of these compounds that were specifically formulated to repel mosquitoes. But they will give you some protection, absolutely.
All right, well, let's continue show and tell. And we were talking about ticks, so let's jump into them real quick first. And talk about what we're seeing when it comes to the tick population in our area.
Well, you know, there's good and bad news in the tick world. As I said before, we're seeing an expansion of this particular character. This is called the Lone Star tick. Now, this tick does not carry the Lyme disease bacterium, but it carries a couple other disagreeable ones. One is ehrlichiosis. That's no picnic either. But again, with this climate change, we're seeing an expansion of the range of the Lone Star tick. It's all the way up now into New England and places like this. If there's good news, Michael, this winter has been a little bit dry and rather warm. What we find is that in years where we have drought coupled with low rainfall or low snowfall and warmer temperatures, that the survival of these overwintering ticks actually goes down. So if there's any good news, I think the good news may be that in this winter that was mild and a little bit droughty, we may actually see fewer ticks this season than we might in a more normal year where temperatures are colder and it's been moister.
Now, talk about people's homes. Is there anything you can do outside to keep your lawn more of an off zone from these different insects?
I think landscape design is very important here. These ticks basically depend on small rodents as being a primary food source. We also find these small rodents like the white-footed mouse. Hey, they're the principal reservoir for that bacteria that is carried into the human body that causes Lyme disease. So if we can reduce those populations of small rodents, mice, raccoons, skunks around our property, we're also probably going to reduce the likelihood of transmission of things like Lyme disease. Now, how can you do this? Well, one thing is to get rid of the clutter. Mice, other small mammals like to have brush piles. They like to have places to hide. So eliminate those places that they can hide. The other effect you can use here is to make a very distinct border between your lawn and whatever is right next to the lawn. So if it's an undisturbed area, a meadow, or perhaps grading into a forest, try to make that border less hospitable to those small rodents. Perhaps mulch in that area, plant some little shrubs, get rid of all the clutter. This opens up the habitat. This will allow the predators of these small rodents, things like hawks and perhaps even cats, to find them and reduce their population. So landscape design is important.
No. All right. Well, let's talk a bit. First of all, I got to just note that, we bring in little dogs every now and then in the studio.
Yeah.
Everybody's like, "Oh, look in the studio!" But now you're getting some interesting faces as people walk by and see your show and tell collection. Let's look at the ticks a bit, and we got to give credit to Tiffany there too, because she's behind the camera here on Facebook Live, and she's really loving this assignment.
She's down there with the stink bugs, and unfortunately, those stink bugs are really stinking today, aren't they, Tiffany? Yeah, they are. She's shaking her head. Yeah.
Well, and by the way, as you show off the what you brought you brought some ticks in, right, to take a look at?
I don't have any ticks. No, I'm fresh out of ticks today.
All right,
but
that's okay.
I do have tick pictures. But
there's no complaints about that.
Yeah, sorry. No, fresh out of ticks.
And by the way, Facebook Live, we're watching the questions here. So if you have any questions for Mike while he's here, please write them our way, and just write them there in the comments section here on Facebook Live. And thanks for joining us this afternoon again here with Mike Rapp with University of Maryland. We're talking bugs, the bug guy, and let's go into stink bugs.
Right.
Those this is the time of the year, right? We're going to start seeing them around our homes.
Yeah, the exodus is underway. They in the autumn they were seeking protected locations. They got up in your attic. They got under my eaves. They're starting to become active. They're showing up on my windowsill, trying to get back outdoors. There are leaves on trees, fruits and flower. That's what they really want. So they're on their way out. So really, with stink bug management, it all begins again in the autumn. Anything you can do to exclude these stink bugs from your home, that means to caulk, get up in the attic, put in those gable end window screen vents. That'll keep them from entering your home. That's going to cut down on the problem next spring. But as these things emerge, you can either simply vacuum them up with a dust buster, get them in that vacuum, dump them out in a plastic bag. You can either, what I do with these guys, once I've got them in a plastic bag, I'll throw them in the freezer for 2 weeks. That's going to take care of them. They will not withstand cold very well this time of year. And then I just add them to my compost. The other thing I find you can do is you can simply fill a little tumbler with a little bit of water and soap. You hold it underneath the stink bugs, and for some reason they want to take a dive into that water. Now, they're not very good swimmers. They will perish pretty quickly. These also then get added to my compost. So I simply recycle the stink bugs I find in my home.
All right. Well, and just don't smash them is what you learned from a kid, and that's
they are pretty stinky.
All right.
Yes, indeed.
Question about the stink bugs. One person was wondering, what can you do to repel stink bugs?
There's not a heck of a lot you can do to repel stink bugs. Again, they're going to be attacking your plants in your garden. There are many products on the market. There are several for homeowners ready-to-use products. What we found is they're relatively easy to kill if you can kill those early stages as soon as they hatch from the egg. We call these the nymphs. You can either simply remove the egg masses, that takes care of the problem pronto, or if you find these immature stages of stink bugs, you can simply spray them with a little insecticidal soap or horticultural spray oil. You contact them, and that's going to take care of them. They're rather quite susceptible to various chemicals that you can buy in your home and garden centers.
We also got one other question here from Dylan, and I know this was something a couple of years ago. Just be curious to see where it stands. When it comes to ticks, there were reports that it could lead to a meat allergy. Is this something you looked into?
Absolutely, yeah. No, it's a very curious phenomenon. What happens is once they've fed on certain other mammals outside, they introduce into your body an antigen, and this stimulates your immune system against certain proteins that are found in meat. If I'm not mistaken, they call this interim alpha-gal. And what happens then, after your immune system has been primed through that tick bite, you now have an allergy to red meats, things like beef and pork. So that's absolutely true. It's also my understanding that this is another one that can be carried or introduced by this little rascal here, the Lone Star tick. So your listener is 100% right. They can cause a meat allergy.
All right. And I know one thing we didn't talk about with the ticks, when you take them off.
Yes.
there's a method to do that. So if anybody's unfamiliar, kind of go through the method of the correct way if you've been bit.
I'm not sure I've got the correct method. I've had Lyme disease 3 times. So the trick here, again, with ticks is always, if you've been outdoors, probably the most important thing to do is once you come indoors, you should probably take those clothes and put them either directly into the laundry, so any ticks that are on those clothes will wind up in the washer. Secondly, always perform a full body check. Have someone assist you in this for those hard to see places back there. But if you can get those ticks off within the first 24 hours, the chances of you contracting Lyme disease or another one of these tick-borne diseases goes to about 0. So get them off quickly before they embed. Once they've been on for 36 hours or so, the chances are relatively high that if they are indeed infected with the bacteria, that it has transferred to you. Now, how to get them off? Well, I kind of go old school on this. You don't use things like Vaseline.
Okay.
You do not hold a burnt match or a burning match to the rear end of a tick. That will only aggravate this tick, and you'll only scorch yourself. This is not a good idea. Use a pair of tweezers. Try to grasp that tick as close to the skin as possible, and with a slow, steady pull, extract the tick. Now, about 50% of the time, the mouth parts will break off. That's my experience. About half the ticks I remove, they're still embedded in my skin. I usually simply take a little bit of Neosporin antiseptic and I apply it over it. Once the tick has been removed, it can no longer transfer that bacterium from its gut through its salivary glands and into you. So once it's off of there, you don't have to worry about that. Okay.
And let's jump into the stinging
Sure.
insects as well, because obviously we're getting that time of year. You're going to start working on your lawn. You're going to find some critters that are on eaves, in bushes, that sort of thing. What are some of the stinging insects which are going to start cropping up here?
Well, I think the most important ones we'll see right now. Many of our paper wasps are beginning to set up territories. In other words, the queen has successfully overwintered. She's going to begin to found a colony, and if that colony is in the overhang just under your front door, what I usually do at this stage of the game is simply get out there with a broom and knock it down, because there usually is a single wasp, paper wasp, in that colony. And again, they do pose a risk to visitors, your family. If this is off somewhere under a tool shed where it's out of the way, hey, I may just let those things go because they're highly beneficial. Paper wasps kill vast numbers of pests that we find in our garden and on our plants. So if it's out of sight, out of mind, I just let them roll. By knocking that nest down, it will force that little queen to go out and find a more hospitable place to build her nest, and she can provide that ecosystem service of killing pest insects elsewhere instead of underneath your eave. The other one we'll see very shortly are ground nesting yellow jackets. These are often confused with ground nesting bees, which will be active now and continue to be active. Ground nesting bees are fundamentally harmless. All they're trying to do is build a nest in that soil to raise their young. They're very reticent. They're non-aggressive. They are not going to sting you. So ground nesting bees are very different than these colonial yellow jackets, which build very large nests and are highly aggressive. When I have a yellow jacket nest on my property that poses a threat to visitors or myself when I'm mowing my lawn, and I tell you I've been stung more than once, when I've run that lawnmower over a yellow jacket nest, I simply eliminate these with a wasp or hornet spray.
All right. Well, real quick, I know you brought some things on pins here, and you want to show our Facebook audience what you have there? And
well, the other guy that really has kind of captured our attention around the Washington, D.C. area this year and over the past recent years is this very, very egregious borer. This is a beetle called the emerald ash borer, and it's been responsible for the death of some 100 million ash trees throughout North America since its introduction and detection back in the early 2000s. It's now very common here in the DMV. I've been on the C&O Canal the past 2 weekends, and there are literally scores, if not hundreds, of magnificent ash trees that are now being killed by this invasive insect pest. So this is generally considered to be the #1 pest of ash trees in both the built environment, places like Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, but also in our natural forest. So this is a real bad performer.
And then I know the pine beetles, are those still an issue? I know we heard about those.
Pine beetles are a huge issue. Again, with the warming world, they've now expanded their range. They used to be found in New Jersey. They've now been detected successfully overwintering as far north as New York State. So southern pine beetle continues to be a major issue. Out west, again, with the mountain pine beetles and the western pine beetle, because those forests are now warming. The lethal cold temperatures, negative 28 degrees Fahrenheit, that used to limit their range, guess what? Negative 28 is now moving its way up the mountain, so beetles are now have entire new portions of forest to attack. So in terms of a warming world, I don't frankly see a lot of good news from the pest standpoint right now, Michael.
All right. Well, what are we doing? What are the studies going on to try to, turn things around?
Well, here's some good news then. Let's deal with some good news. How many of your listeners think that they're having fewer stink bugs here in 2017 than they did, let's say, back in 2010 or 2008?
I'll raise my hand because when I first moved here about 4 years ago, they were all over the place. Haven't seen them at all this year yet.
Well, it's pretty interesting. If you remember H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds, do you recall what undid the alien? It's a little pop quiz.
I don't know if I remember.
It was the microbes. Remember, the smallest of creatures that God had placed on Earth, according to H.G. Wells, were the ones that actually undid the aliens. And we're finding the same effect right here. Now, it's not necessarily microbes. They're part of the story. But we're finding many of our indigenous natural enemies, many of the beneficial insects that are already resident right here in Maryland and in North America, have now jumped over and are reducing the populations of stink bugs. That's number one. When we have these tremendous fluctuations, as we are going to see in a climate changing world, these polar vortices that descend very quickly, we found some scientists down at Virginia Tech discovered that when we have rapid cool downs early in the season, those cold temperatures may actually put a major beat down on the stink bugs that are trying to overwinter. And the third factor, which is very curious, we had a student recently complete a study, and he was able to find that the microbiome, we all have a microbiome associated with our gut. These are beneficial bacteria that help us digest our food. Well, guess what? Stink bugs are exactly the same way. And the female stink bug leaves behind a residue of microbes on the surface of the stink bug eggs. Once they ingest these bacteria, they colonize the gut and ensure the survival of the nymphs. We're finding that one of our students found that at warm temperatures, hot temperatures as we see here in Maryland, once it hits to the 90s, that microbiome may actually be disabled or affected in a very negative way in the gut. So it could be some like it hot, some don't, some like it cold, some don't, and our natural enemies have kind of teamed up and are now putting the beat down on stink bugs. So as we think that's seeing the decline in the stink bug populations. That's good news.
All right, and real quick, before we wrap things up again,
Sure.
if you want to get a question answered here by Mike, who's here ready to take your questions, you can type that into the comment section there on Facebook Live. Any parting thoughts for us as we go out there and we start to enjoy the spring weather? We emerge from...
Take your cautions, but this should not keep anybody from going outdoors and enjoying our beautiful DMV spring and summer. You're going to learn more by going outside and watching what bugs do and what nature does than reading it from books. That's my experience. So it's okay. Get ready. It's going to be hot, but be prepared.
All right. Thank you so much, Mike Raup. He's a professor of entomology, the bug guy from the University of Maryland. Thanks again, Mike.
Thanks again, Mike. Always a pleasure.